Hey, it's Doc Halak here again with another Video Essentials tutorial. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about many of the camera moves that you will be using as a videographer. I'll start getting you into some of the jargon and terminology that is used in order to be successful in your job. Let's go ahead and talk about some of the camera techniques and camera moves that you will use to be a successful videographer. But before we get there, let's do our usual vocabulary review. Again, with the vocabulary, I want you to make sure that you are consulting the complete vocabulary list for this section. This section that we're doing is vocabulary for shooting number one. The first two terms that we're going to use go well together: A-roll and B-roll. A-roll is the primary video footage of a scene or an interview. That's the shot of the person that you're interviewing, the person that's appearing on camera. That is your A-roll, your primary footage. Secondary to that is what we call B-roll. B-roll covers up the footage of that individual, and it is footage that goes along with what is being spoken in the primary footage. It's not just random footage, it's footage that complements what is being said by the primary speaker or interviewee. The next term is call sheet. The call sheet is something that you'll encounter if you're working on a large video crew, whether it's for, say, a broadcast team doing a sports production, or maybe you're on a film crew on location. A call sheet outlines the schedule and all the other essential details for that day's shoot. It does not include a script, but it's going to list things like all the people that need to be on location, all of the equipment that's required, what scenes from the script are planned for the day, and other information like that. That's where you're going to encounter a thing called a call sheet. Anytime you're hired on a crew and you're asked to refer to the call sheet, make sure you do so because it includes a lot of important information. Setup is a term that we use for placing a camera in position or setting up a scene with the camera. There are typically several setups on a particular location or a particular shooting day. The more setups you have, the longer the day is likely to be. So you want to make sure that your setups are completed quickly and efficiently as you move through your shooting day. As with all of our terminology, be sure to check out that Video Essentials vocabulary list for all the terms related to this lesson under Shooting 1. Now, let's get to camera moves. You've heard a bunch of terms, or you will hear a bunch of terms. What do all these mean? Well, we'll talk about that. And why do we have all these special terms? The reason for that is so that we can be precise in our communication. Just like any other profession, videography, the video business, broadcasting, has its own jargon and terminology. And that's why we're emphasizing the vocabulary so much, because we want you to be proficient in the terminology of the video industry. When we start talking about camera moves, our camera can be placed on the X, Y, or Z axis. And so it can really be placed anywhere. If you're the camera operator and the director calls for something and you don't understand these terms, then you're not going to understand where to place your camera or how to move your camera in order to give the director what he or she is looking for. On the flip side of that, if you are the director, you want to be able to communicate well with your camera operator and the rest of your crew. That's why we want you to know these terms and use them precisely in your communication. The first term that we're going to use is tilt. Sometimes this term is used, or rather not used, incorrectly. A lot of times you'll hear people use the term pan up or pan down. That's incorrect terminology. A tilt is the correct term for moving the camera up or down. It's just like nodding your head up or down. That's a tilt. Just like in this diagram here on this slide, you will tilt up or tilt down. Let's take a look at what that looks like on video. You'll notice with this video, it's a slow tilt up. And at the end of this, you'll notice that the frame is nicely composed. That's what you want to do with any camera movement. You want to know where you're going to begin and where you're going to end. This move ends on a very nicely composed shot of the Missouri River. That is a tilt. Similar to a tilt is a pan, and that's the terminology we use very, very frequently. We hear that used a lot. A pan is a side-to-side pivot of your camera. Just like in this diagram, your camera pivots from side to side. You're either panning left or panning right. And be aware that with the tilt and the pan both, if you're the camera operator behind the camera making that move, your hands are going to go in the opposite direction. That means if the director calls for a pan left, your hands will go to the right, so that the front of the camera, the lens, will go in the direction that the director has called for. Let's watch this short little clip here of a pan and a couple of things that I want you to note as we watch this. First of all, note that as the car moves, the camera pans, keeping the car in frame. Also, we've got that defined ending point where the camera movement is going to end. Let's take a look right here. The camera is panning, keeping the car in frame, and it stops right there, allowing the car to drive out of the frame. That's an excellent technique. Whenever you're doing a camera movement, especially a pan, you don't want to pan forever and ever and ever. You want to allow the subject to exit the frame. That creates a really nice edit point. The next move is a zoom. A zoom is simply changing the focal length of a lens, making the subject appear to be closer. Typically, we want to be very sparing with these moves. We don't like to zoom on air much, but sometimes it's needed. As we watch this clip, I want you to pay attention to the headroom of the subject. Notice that the headroom, while it adjusts somewhat, it generally remains the same or keeps the subject in frame as the frame size decreases. So here we go. This is kind of a slow zoom. You notice that the subject's head remains in the frame, even though the headroom decreases a little bit as it goes. You're going to have to adjust the tilt on the camera ever so slightly as the zoom goes in. You're going to have to tilt up slightly. If you were zooming out, you would tilt down slightly in order to keep the headroom appropriate. The next shot we're going to talk about is called a dolly. A dolly is when the camera moves either forward or backwards, physically moving closer or further from the subject. During a dolly, you'll have to adjust the focus because the distance between the camera and the subject is either decreasing or increasing, depending on the way the dolly moves. It's not the same as a zoom because the zoom changes the focal length and changes how deep the depth of field is within that scene while the camera remains stationary. With a dolly, the depth of field does not change. But because you're changing the distance between the camera and the subject, you do have to adjust the focus of your camera. With the exception of if the camera is moving at the same speed as the subject, which we're going to see in this example here. As this woman is running, pay attention to how the camera is dollying backwards. It's not quite at the same speed as the woman running. You can see the camera is moving because the trees in the background. Let's go ahead and watch that one more time. The camera is moving and it's keeping the same distance here between the runner and the camera. Notice that the framing of the subject changes at a slower rate than the movement itself, the movement of her running. What's really fun is when we can combine a dolly and a zoom together. The first time this was done was clear back in 1958 in the Alfred Hitchcock film called Vertigo. You can notice in this shot from Goodfellas that the camera is zooming and dollying at the same time. And the way we know that is that the relationship between the subjects in the foreground and the background is changing ever so slightly. But the framing within the shot is not changing because the camera operator is zooming out. If you watch the curtains in the background on the edges of the frame, you can tell there's just a little bit of adjustment in the framing. This is a combination of zooming and dollying. It's not a usual camera move. It's not one that is used commonly because it's a bit more complicated, but it can be kind of fun to re-emphasize or make the scene appear as though it's moving or shifting in relationship to the background and foreground. The next kind of movement is called a truck. A truck is when the camera moves physically side to side. This is not a pivot. The camera is not pivoting on its mount on the tripod, but it's sliding, just like this slider you see over in the lower right-hand corner of this slide. The camera slides from one direction to the other, left or right. We would truck left or truck right, physically moving the camera perpendicular to its subject. Let's take a look from behind the camera. And again, as you're watching this, notice the difference of this move as compared to a zoom or a pan. It's a very different effect here. This camera is trucking along this scene with all the fruit. The next move is called a pedestal. With a pedestal, the camera raises or lowers on its mount. That mount is often called a pedestal also. Don't be confused by that. The mount is what allows the camera to make the move. If the camera is mounted on a pedestal, then it allows you as the camera operator to either pedestal up or pedestal down. And we've got an example of this move from the movie Toy Story. Take a look here and notice how during this move there is new information revealed. Secondary to that, it's a well-framed shot when the camera move ends. There you go. That's a pedestal, raising from a lower camera position to a higher camera position, just in a straight vertical movement. The next shot is called a crane or a jib shot. This is very similar to a pedestal to the untrained eye, but once you know what you're looking for, you're going to easily notice some differences between this crane shot or jib shot. This is the mount that you're seeing right here. It's what's called a jib or a crane. Typically, it's called a jib if it's a smaller unit. If it's a larger unit, then we refer to it as a crane. This just pivots at that pivot point towards the end of the pole and raises or lowers the camera. Once again, let's take a look at what that looks like through the viewfinder. As we do so, notice in this shot how the move is used as a transition from one subject to a new subject. Once again, the final framing of the new subject is framed very nicely. The last shot I'm going to show you is kind of interesting. It's called a Dutch shot, a Dutch tilt, or a Dutch angle. This shot angles the subject or the frame within the camera, just like the words here are angled just a bit. This is another fun shot, but again, use it sparingly. It's not used often, but as we watch this clip, you want to note the angle of the horizon line and how that changes while the subject remains framed nicely within the camera. That is a Dutch angle. Practice makes perfect, right? So now, what I'd like you to do is take out your camera and try these moves for yourself. Whether you've got a video camera, a DSLR, or whether you just have your phone, I want you to go out and try each of these shots and practice them. Learn the terminology so that you can communicate clearly while working on your video crew in the industry. Be sure that you use these terms correctly so that you sound and act like a professional. I'm looking forward to seeing your shots and seeing your camera work on the air. I'm Doc Locke, and this is another Video Essentials tutorial.